Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. Lovely to have a few of you with us live, and those of you that will be watching this webinar on recording, hello to you too. We're starting now. We were just having a last-minute conflab as a group of speakers because, confession up front, we haven't done a practice run of this webinar. So I hope you're looking forward to a lively, free-flowing conversation from the four of us today. Just before we begin, quick introductions to myself. So I'm bee.heller. I'm a co-founder of The Pioneers. We're a consultancy that's all about making people happier at work. I have, on the topic of HR tech, and in particular, data, why getting your people data in one place is the best decision you'll ever make. I have three fabulous speakers, all of whom are very good friends as well. So without further ado, I will get them to introduce themselves so you can learn why they are experts on this topic. And with experts in mind, I will start with you, Matt.
All right, yeah, thanks. My name's Matt. I am the other co-founder of The Pioneers, but Bee and I are amicably divorcing. And I'm going off to start a new business called Yuda. One of the things that's motivating what we're doing with Yuda is this idea about how do you set your data architecture up in the right way so you can learn and experiment as you grow. So I'm interested in joining in the conversation this afternoon.
Fabulous, thank you, Matt. And Soo Ling, if you could share a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself for those that are here today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Soo Ling, so I'm the Honorary Associate Professor at UCL, and I'm also the CTO of Yuda, so I'm helping Matt on all things tech side for the company.
So it's good that you're here, Soo Ling, because we have a genuine expert in our midst, which is useful. And another expert in our midst, Elisa. Do you want to share an introduction to yourself as well?
Sure. So I am a UX UI designer focused on B2B software. I call myself specifically a data designer because I'm really interested in sort of how data relates to our lives and how we're supposed to use it and operationalize it. And that's sort of my background was in economics, and then sort of that wasn't giving me enough of the information, that empathy, like human information. So that's sort of how I pivoted to design. And I think so I'm sort of a trader amongst both. And yeah, really interested in sort of what we currently do with data, what we can continue to do with data, and how I can stop being a trader and really marry those kind of emotion and empiricism together.
Perfect. So you're going to be a great person for us to come to when we start talking about, so we're doing a good job of collecting data. What on earth do we now do with that data? Right, hopefully you can all see us a bit fuller screened now. Where to start this conversation? So I was thinking about this. I wondered whether, maybe Matt, could you just share some of the signs that a company might start to notice if they've got a people data issue? What might they be seeing, and what are some of those issues that companies face?
Well, in the context of scale-ups, I think that's the place to start. I guess the first one, the most common one, is you're building an organization, you're growing very quickly, you start on Google Sheets, right? Everyone starts on Google Sheets, and it's quite easy to get to a position where everything is on Google Sheets, or some stuff's on an Excel, or you've got bits of information lying all over the organization and in different places. And at some point you get this awful realization of you just can't find the stuff you need, right? You can't find where things are held. And in particular, it's very difficult to consolidate the information that sits across all those different Google Sheets and to make it commensurate. So I think that's the first challenge, is, if you like, leaving it a bit too late, and not getting your data into good shape early on so that you can start to learn properly as you grow about what you're doing with your people. The second challenge as well is the one you get with organizations that are maybe a bit further along the line. So organizations that may be approaching 1,000 people, going past 1,000 people. And the typical pattern I think we see in that situation is people start buying best in category HR tech, right? So, you buy an HRIS, you buy an ATS, you buy something to do surveys, you buy something to do feedback, you buy something to help with learning, and so on and so forth. And each of those systems fills a particular need at the time. But what you find is when you get to about 1,000 people, 1,500 people, you've got 15, 20, maybe 25 systems that sit within your HR tech stack, and each of them has their own silo of data. And I was talking to a fintech recently. You know, their strategy was that they're the best in category for each area of the employee experience, and now they have to employ a data scientist on their team full time to clean up those sources of data before they can do anything interesting with it. And that's, I think, a real challenge for you if you want to use your people data really effectively. And the bit, I guess, to close off, the litmus test for me, and which is why I'm really interested in Elisa's contribution to this, is your people data has to inform decision making, right? And if you're just collecting stuff but not using stuff, you've got a people data problem. And it's only when you're using your data to inform decision making, and using your data to inform decision making in all of your teams, not just at the exec team level, that you know you're using your data effectively.
Cool. So maybe just to build on that, Soo Ling, you've spent lots of time working in various startups, and has there been a particular pain that startups have experienced where the data we've got a data issue now? Matt's talked about some of the different ways that maybe people manage it or the causes of it, but what's the pain
I
or the
think
emotional experience?
most startups are like permanently semi on fire or like seriously on fire. So, and it's usually external. So a lot of them, they're just not thinking about people data at all. Like when you talk to them about people, like what data, customers, users, investors, funding, there's so many things on fire. And the most common people data issue is, there is none, there's no data, or not collected in any like methodological way, or not much thought put into it. So that's the main problem that a lot of startups have.
And Elisa, to sort of round off the three different perspectives on this issue of what are the issues from your experience, what have you noticed what are the painful experiences that companies have had around people?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've already touched on is like either there's none, too little, or there's sort of, it's become a hassle, like it feels like too much because it's sort of all over the place. And I think that resonates with both my experiences. And then I guess also what I've seen is like, it's also that the remedy can also kind of make the original problem worse. So if you solve it in the wrong way, then you're living with this solution that might have made sense at the point you were putting out that fire, but really it's becoming this load you're hauling with you. So I do think it's a very tough to hit the right middle ground of like just the right amount of effort, just the right size system, just the right amount of data, and that's difficult for everybody in every case.
So if it's it is a difficult problem to solve, where's a good place to begin? Maybe I'll stick with you, Elisa. If you were going to somebody's starting to think about the data and how that might inform what they build in terms of their people experience, where's a good place to start?
I mean, I think with data, simpler is better. Like to start with the facts as best you can, and recording those is probably the right place to start. So meaning from that basic of like, do you know who works for you and what their basic information is, to like, what was their start date? That sort of a piece of data might sound so simple, is actually much more important than what's their favorite color, like, so I think it's really starting as simple as you can with setting up the infrastructure. And then when more complex solutions or problems arise, addressing those, at least for the beginning, like one by one, building, when you're ready to build up the whole system, that's a whole other thing. But when you're just sort of getting started, just get started.
And this issue of just starting to collect the essential data, how important is it? There's collecting the data, but there's also making that essential data available to the people who need it, which is kind of a different problem, right? There's the story. You're not probably going to have managers who've got access to, your main database, but they probably do need to know when a new hire started, so they know maybe when they should be having some kind of 3-month review or a probation review or those sorts of things. So I don't know, open a comment on collecting the right data, but also making sure that data is available to the right people. Anybody want to take that?
Just on the first one, I just think in the people space particularly, people just don't make good use of automations, right? It would not take you a great deal of time to build a bot once that collects all the information you need from a new starter. And to Elisa's point, getting that right, and like from the start is, I mean, there's certain stuff you have to do from a compliance point of view, but it's not that difficult to put that in place and start capturing that data. How you play that back is then, I think, a decision about systems and when you invest in systems. And I can actually understand people holding back on those decisions for a bit of time. Like if it's, you know, Soo Ling made the perfectly valid point, like startups tend to be in on fire mode, right? And the playback of some of this data is very unlikely to be top of the to-do list for a long period of time. But that it's almost separating the two, like collecting it is a fairly easy solution to sort from the get-go that you know you need to do. And the sooner you start doing that, the better equipped you are to learn as you grow. Because otherwise you get to a place where you can't look back and look at what's worked and what hasn't worked. And then the other point, I totally agree with what Elisa was saying, is sort of then, once you've got that baseline level of compliance in, which I think, as I say, you should automate the capture of that, then it's about, okay, every time you look to do something, what's the data you need to work out whether that's effective or not? You know, so if your focus is on recruitment, don't just do stuff like, what's the feedback loop? What's the data you need to capture to mean that in the future you can make better decisions, either about how you're attracting people or the selection process you're making for people and those sorts of things. And rather than try and solve the whole system problem from the outset, just make sure that you have, in my opinion, like an experimental mindset. Like the key for me in people in scale-ups is there's so much unknown and uncertainty and absence of structure that the challenge is, how do you make a better decision in a month's time or 6 months time or a year's time? And having that mindset, what's the data I need to generate, is, I think, the way to move forward.
Well, so that's really helpful. I just want to come back to one of the earlier points you made there around, it's really easy to automate stuff and it's easy to collect. It should be easy for particularly startups who've maybe not done anything yet in this space to build right first time. And Soo Ling, I'll come to you on that as the sort of the technical expert. How easy is it really? And maybe two scenarios. So how easy is it if you really haven't done anything in the people data space yet, versus you're actually maybe, I don't know, 50 people or so. So you're still a relatively small business, but you might be in that situation where you do have quite a few systems already and you didn't make the early decision to pull data together. So those two scenarios.
Yeah, I think the
how
answer
would you
to that is always like, it depends. But I think starting from scratch sometimes like has its advantages because you don't have any baggage. The pain from moving between systems is always you are at the mercy of whoever, you know, you have your people data with. You know, if you choose a supplier that makes it very difficult for you to move systems, you may lose your data in the process of moving. Of course, if you don't have that much history, then you can start again. And we have had situations where every time, you know, in the past, we decide to change systems where they're not good or the startup has scaled beyond the initial point, of losing data because it's either impossible to move them out or too painful that it's not worth the effort. Yeah. So that's.
So you're at the mercy of the suppliers that you choose. If you haven't yet chosen suppliers, are there things that you might have on a checklist or things that you should watch out for, so that if you do want to change course or make a different decision in the future, it could make your life easier? What are the questions that you should be asking around data?
Yeah, make sure that you actually own your data, that you can move it, take it out, and you know, not painfully, because some of them, like, it's always the small print, like you rather die than take your data. Yeah, you can, but you're gonna suffer. Yeah, so check that carefully. Yeah.
Okay. And Elisa, for you,
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, just to Soo Ling's point, like, when you are choosing people systems for a scale up, you've got to be mindful that they could have quite a short lifespan. The faster you're growing, the shorter the lifespan. And I think people over-index on onboarding. How do I get this thing up and running? And they don't think about, how do I come off this? Or what's the risk for me to come off this? And it's a really good, it's a really good thing to think through before you get into it. Like, okay, at some point, it's almost certain I'm going to want to come off this. How does that work? What happens to that? Because otherwise, you sacrifice all that potential learning around your data every time you switch a system.
Yeah, no, good, really, really good advice. I want to now just, you made a really good point, Matt, about having a sort of experimental mindset in the way that you look to think about the kind of data that you capture. And Elisa, I was maybe going to go to you next and just ask, from your experience, so the sorts of systems that you've worked with in the past have collected huge amounts of data in very big companies. How have you seen this? Have you seen an experimental mindset play out in that environment? And where have you seen that work really effectively?
Well, I think so, to the point that Soo Ling was making earlier, the second you're trying to do something experimental, you realize what you've got, you know, like the second you're trying to do something new with it. So a lot of my experiences were about actually trying to use the data to make like a machine learning type to automate some process.
Oh,
We
can you still hear me? Sorry.
You're back.
I don't know. Okay, so I was saying about automating a process with machine learning. And basically that's when the rubber hits the road in terms of what is the data that you actually have and what form is it in. And that process often was like, you know, that could easily delay the process by 1.5 years just because either the data is there and it's hard to work with. Like if the data is there, great. You know, if it's clean, which it rarely is, that's, you know, it's there, whatever you want. But if it doesn't even exist, then you're starting from literally zero, which to the point could be great for an experimental approach. You know exactly what you're trying to prove, but you have that sort of limitation. So that would be my first experience is data will always be, it's a huge manual task a lot of the time with data, no matter what you're trying to do. But it is also like the most scientific material that we have within a business. So it's actually like, I would say, you must think like a scientist, like the mad scientist, you know, like embrace that instinct because that is what scientists are doing on a regular basis. They're creating data to try and prove something, and they're in a very scientific process. And that is sort of the way that you would, data and experimentation should go hand in hand. I don't think they always do, but you know, in our sort of practices, they should.
Would you have advice for people on the extent to which you should look to use existing data or existing sources of data versus going out there to collect new data to test your hypotheses? Is one better than the other? Is it a bit of both? Like what? Yeah, because you talked about potentially almost layering up your problems later. Like you could, it's infinite, the data that you could collect.
It's true. I guess my quick note on that is, I think whenever you're trying to do something strategic with data, it's about trying to be impartial and to try and do everything to fight your human instinct to have an opinion. And so I think when it comes to like, if you have the data, you should be using it, but you should be very aware that you made that. That is exactly what you produced. So it might tell you exactly what you want it to tell you because you made it to tell you that. Whereas when you're starting from scratch, I think if the data always is confirming your bias, you've got a problem. So I think that's sort of, just know that you made that if you have it and it's got all of your culture baked right into it.
Yeah.
If you're trying to understand something about your culture.
Yeah. So if every experiment's a success, you might want to think about how you're measuring the impact of something.
In a sense,
okay,
it's
so
like,
maybe
being
that's
like a very good scientist, like just be suspicious of everything. Yeah.
So we're all suspicious scientists now. With that suspicious scientist hat on, then maybe if it is a blank canvas, we're not experimenting, what is the kind of data that we should be thinking about collecting? Let's go beyond sort of the early start date, employee name, date, like the basics that we need to employ people. But what's the kind of data about our employees that we might want to collect that will enable us to really build sort of those best-in-class people experiences? And some of that can be, the basics too. Like, you can't forget about those. I take your point about the favorite color thing. So
I was going to jump in and take one of the most basic away, and then I think the others will have much more creative answers. I was going to say, I think just a really good tracking of the employee life cycle is really important, because that's the sort of data that's not going to bias you, like I said, like sort of give you this sort of grand narrative in it. That 6 months this happened, 2 years this happened, they were promoted, that sort of basic information is really the data of the employee life cycle. It's not like, did they have friends, was it working out? It was just sort of this data. And I think we can tell that doesn't tell the whole story. And that's why I like sort of starting from that basic employee life cycle data as much as you can.
It's objective facts about about those periods. Yeah. Okay. Same question for you then, Matt. What's the kind of data that you would like to see companies collecting, or you think could make the greatest difference to the types of people experiences we can build?
Well, just to build on what Lisa said, I think you need to think about the demographic data you're collecting on people. So particularly if you're interested in DE&I, like you need some reference point that will enable you to look back and say, are we working for all the types of people we're looking to attract to this organization? So there's and that actually needs some thinking through, depending on what type of business you are, and in particular, if you like, what are the hidden points of intersectionality that might affect your business, rather than just some of the broad categories. So there's that sort of stuff. The second category for me is feedback. Like, I think, the health of a system is primarily driven by the quality and immediacy of the feedback loops. So what are the feedback loops? And as a general rule, I think people teams fall into the trap of trying to do it too infrequently. Like we do a 6-month survey or a 12-month survey, and that's all we're capturing. And it would be much better to get less feedback more frequently, and to get it around particular issues or topics or experiences. Like are you, how does this piece work, etc., etc. And then ideally, I think you want to be able to look at how that feedback data that actually correlates with people's behavior. Like, what are they actually doing? And the bit that Soo Ling and I are particularly interested in UDA is when you start to look at that with an event log of what people are actually doing. Like, who actually looked at this training video? Did they finish that training video? Did that then correlate with the feedback from the people that work with them or with other things? It's like you do want, I think, to get people's subjective interpretation of what's going on around them, but to the point about bias, you want to have some other types of data that helps you counterbalance some of that. Like, what did people actually do, not just what do people think.
Yeah. Okay, that's so lots more that I can follow up on there. But Soo Ling, for you, what are the categories of data that you think can that people should collect that could make a difference to the people experience?
So I think one important one that's quite difficult is like when there's so many different tools now that we're making our people use. Like, one important one is like, how are they using every new tool or every new process that you have implemented in a way that you can then get, like Matt said, immediate feedback about the effectiveness of some new rollout of a process or a tool. And if it's not good enough, change it or something. Yeah, so that's a very useful one, because if you kind of make people use something that's not very helpful for their everyday work, it really, detracts them from working. And
And sorry, so my, I guess, follow-up question on these sorts of things is again back to the users of the data, because some of these trends take quite like a reasonably high level of analysis to work out like what's correlating, what's what might be causing one thing and another. And even if you're not interested in causation and correlation, there's still a basic level of statistics that you probably want to understand as a as an experimenter in a business. So how easy is it in reality for people sitting in people teams who maybe don't have such a background in analysis and statistics?
I think you can start simple. So it wouldn't be like, we are not looking at whether or not a comparison between tool A and B is statistically significant or not. So usually the results just scream at you like no one logged in after the training session, or like they use it once, they click twice, and they never go back. So things like this, it should be quite clear.
Okay. I mean, fair enough. I think even I might be able to work out if there is a 0 or a like 10 in terms of number of logs.
Sorry, just to see this point, I do think that in the people space, there's a particular mentality or unwillingness to expose yourself to the risk of failure. Right. So we've all been I've been in HR teams and on the other side, you spend ages choosing a product. You tend, if I'm honest, do a bad job of asking your users or getting some user testing before you choose that product. You then invest some money in that product from your budget. And then it's almost got to work because it's your reputation that's carrying the thing. So let's be honest, most people don't even bother to collect the data about did people open it, use it, etc., because they don't want to know the answer to that. And I think in the context of, particularly in the context of scale-ups, and from a people perspective, you need to have the confidence that you are working in a very complex, very fast-moving environment, and you're going to get lots of stuff wrong, right? What you need to know as quickly as possible is what you've got wrong. And having the data back within 48 hours that says no one's opened this new application is it will hurt at the time, but it's very, very valuable to use, because in other organizations, you do 12 months before anyone reviews the effectiveness of a tool and whether to renew the license, if they ever review it at all. And the challenge is, the more of those things you introduce to an organization that people aren't using, or to Soo Ling's point, they don't like, you just create this. It's like it's a debt. You create this sort of, it's barnacles on the boat, it's more and more stuff you're layering onto the organization that's not actually delivering value. So I think the correlation piece, the causation, like the machine learning, all that, I think is so far down the line for most scale-ups. The focus should be, how do we know whether what we're doing is moving us forward or not, and how do we know whether what we're trying is working or not? And that's quite, if you think in that experimental scientific mindset as the other two have described, that's actually not that difficult to get in place.
I just want to jump on there too, because I think what we were just saying about sort of investing in tech is also what we're talking about with investing in data too. Like, it's going to start sort of cumulatively doing something that you may or may not want it to, and it's going to be really hard to trash it. I will say, I think it's my turn as the designer to say, there are people, you can talk to them. You don't need to do a survey. Like, you don't need to create, like, as a designer, I always see my job when I'm doing user research to create a very soft kind of data where I can say, like, I've talked to 5 people and they're all saying the same thing. I tried to find someone who's saying something the opposite, who's trying to explain to me what's going on. And I really, I just have to sort of wave the flag. Like, you can just go talk to people and get the information, especially if you are, it doesn't really matter the size of the organization, frankly. But especially if you're small, statistics are not going to help you. Talking to people is going to help you a lot more.
Yeah, and you may also have the unintended consequence of going and talking to people, that they discover something exists, that they maybe, the reason it wasn't accessed because they didn't even know that it was out there and available. So you're both collecting that soft data And you're probably doing a good context.
And your causation and correlation are becoming very clear. Yeah. Not scientifically proven, but pretty confident.
I think that's a good designer flag wave.
But we
don't have to treat everybody like robots.
Sorry, but again, I know I've made this point already, but data is only useful if you're using it. And that's why I think Elisa's on the call, because that's where the rubber hits the road on data. And I see loads of stuff reported about people doing fancy things with machine learning and all this sort of thing. But if it's not informing a business decision, it's not useful. And if people aren't using it it's just, fancy stuff for no real end. And so having that very pragmatic mentality, I think, is really important, particularly in scale-ups. You're not going to have big data sets because you've only got about 100 people. Just do stuff that moves you forward.
Okay, so with that as a fresh starting point, then, can anybody share an example of maybe something they've read about or a direct experience they've had of where a business decision has been genuinely data-led and people, ideally people data-led? So, where perhaps having data, even the soft data, the conversations available, changed the course of action that a company they were working with or working in took. Maybe got a direct example they could share.
I'm thinking back to the do you remember the split test we ran with I don't know if we got it as a case, 5 guys on their onboarding process.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk that through? Your memory's better than mine.
Yeah, I can. I mean, I can. That was a okay. So the setup was working with 5 guys, which is at the time had about 100 restaurants in the UK, and they were looking at a 90-day turnover number. So in terms of the number of people who left, number of employees who left within the first 90 days was actually 50%. So 50% of their people they hired were no longer with the business after being there for 3 months. Which was high, but hospitality, that number is generally quite high. That was extremely high though. And they wanted to therefore do something around their onboarding experience to make it more likely that people were actually having a good time, were more likely to stay with the business. And they knew that if it could get people to stay beyond that initial 3-month period, they're far more likely to stay for a year, 2 years, and much longer. So there was a real benefit to the business. We looked at, through an initial inquiry, what were the sort of things that motivated employees that could make a difference to that onboarding experience. And we did run A/B tests in this scenario because we had the scale to be able to do this and the replicable sort of business units, if you like. So we could run one onboarding process in 10 of their restaurants, a different onboarding process in another 10, and hold another 10 as a control group. We actually ran both of the new interventions in a 4th set of 10 restaurants. One of the onboarding processes looked at how could we make employees really feel like they belong, like they could have a personal impact in that first 90 days. One of the, and that was things like really basic, get the uniform size right and make sure it's there on the first day, like make somebody feel like, they're a valued member of the team, make sure everybody in the team knows their name, welcomes them by name on the first day, make a fuss of them on the first day, those sorts of things. So like, you're a member of our team, you belong here. And then the second intervention looked at how could we give people a sense of progress, like they were learning and developing in their first 3 months. And that looked at things like the one-to-one conversations that they had with their manager, the way that they worked through the different stations. So there are different sets of skills that somebody might need to, that somebody would develop across the restaurant. So like actually cooking the food or putting the food together on the plate or serving at the till. And we looked at the way that they worked through those so they could get this sense of progress, and we could give them reward, like badges for learning each of the new skills. And then we tracked the 90-day turnover across the 40 restaurants. And what we learned through that was actually the progress stuff in the first 90 days had no impact on 90-day turnover beyond the control group. whereas the belonging and significance stuff was twice as effective, reduced 90-day turnover by about 20%. Turnover across the business was falling anyway. So in the control group and the progress group, it fell by 10%, but in the belonging and significance group, it fell by 20%. And it was the same margin in the group that we did everything to. And so the consequence of that for the business's decision making was, well, none of this stuff is a bad idea. like we can go, but if we're going to invest in training our managers in any of the and communicating what's effective, we're going to spend that time and investment and money on the stuff that makes people feel like they belong and are significant in the first 90 days, because that has the greatest impact first. Who knows if we'd have kept tracking for longer and longer, whether progress would have started to become more important beyond 90 days, but it's shifted the company's investment in what they improved in their onboarding process. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a divergent on a case study, but yeah, that was one example.
I think a couple of the things that stood out for me from that is not many teams are prepared to give their people different experiences. Right? If you talk to marketing teams, they're really comfortable with one set of potential customers getting one experience and another getting another, so they can work out, test and learn. Actually, in the people space, we tend to have a sort of universal provision mindset, and that can slow you down. You know, like I think what that Five Guys example shows you is if you deliberately give people different experiences for 6 months, you can actually learn stuff that's really useful and helpful. And the other bit was making sure you had that control group, because you've got a trend, and you've got to account for the trend line within your data as well. So, and I would suggest that holding a control group isn't usual practice within the people space either. They tend not to do that.
Yeah, and also there's not so many employees to do proper experiments with, and you can't torture them too horribly to find out answers.
You can't torture them too horribly. Like just a little bit mild torture, okay.
A little bit, okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of teamwork and things like that, which is why, like at UCL, like we have a project building simulations of teams, because you can't put people that you think, okay, this bunch of people, we think they're not going to work very well together. We just want to, test it out, and then they have a horrible project and then they're scarred forever. You can't do it with real people repeatedly or ever. So you have to do simulations of things.
I like how you're sort of correcting yourself. It's good. You can't do it repeatedly. I mean, ever. No, we never did it.
It does come into the high volume. That's when data really sort of is the only language that you could have figured that out with. I think it's a great mindset to have the experimental sort of, we can run an experiment somehow, some way. It could be, maybe it won't be 6 months, maybe it won't be, on all these different people, but like you can find a way to do that in a less data way that still has the same impact of saying like, well, actually giving someone a t-shirt, like they said that really meant something to them, 3 months later, versus, someone who you didn't do that for, or someone that you gave something else to. I think it doesn't have to be like, I think that's also the balance that I was kind of drawing earlier between sort of when we talk about data, we're talking about like science as much as we can. And when we're talking about our business, it's our baby, or it's our, it's our family, or it's these sort of other people that we know really well. And it's introducing data is sort of about creating that distance when you can, and then knowing that sometimes you don't have that distance, so you have to find another technique to sort of either through an anonymous survey, which would be sort of in the realm of data, or through some sort of other kind of gentle experiment that might kind of help you produce the same result, even if it's not statistically significant. What's amazing is that you were able to do like the scientific work that I think would inform anyone else in their approach. Like, wow, okay, like in this industry and in this type of work, like I was shocked. I wasn't expecting you to say that was the one that worked, Right. So I'm impressed already.
Because the progress in Five Guys, as you get more qualified, your pay goes up. So so it was actually a surprising result. And just listening to you, Elisa, I remember thinking, so a long time ago reading about like why would you want to collect data in a business, and they gave 3 reasons. The first was to reduce the uncertainty around a future decision. And I think your point about you can reduce uncertainty. It doesn't need to be perfect, and it doesn't need to be like, you're not going to get published in one of Soo Ling's journal articles, but it helps you reduce the uncertainty of the future decisions. That's the first reason. The second one was sometimes you want to measure stuff to reinforce a behavior, right? So you can introduce a measure into a business that's going to reinforce the behavior you're looking to promote. And the third one was because the data itself is valuable to you. Like if you were going for an award or something like that, we collect this data, maybe it's greenhouse scores, like we collect this data because actually it's important to our employer brand. But I think particularly that point, it's about reducing the uncertainty. It's not about getting the perfect answer on something.
Yeah, and I think for most companies, I think the constraints are always there. So you don't have the luxury of time for everyone to do everything to the most ideal manner. And also that's like an overkill. So in a lot of time, like good enough is good enough. You don't need to go crazy. Yeah,
and I was just thinking, you've always got the past as a comparison as well. Like obviously context changes and employee numbers grow, but if you're, particularly we talked about collecting feedback earlier, if you're doing that regularly, you can always look at trends, even if you've not got control groups and stuff. You've got the control of history is one comparison that you can always be looking at.
Yeah, and to your point about history, I think you're always looking to make a relative judgment. Like you take feedback. There's no such thing as a good or bad score, but you can get a sense of, is it getting better or worse? And the more you build up that historical record, the less susceptible you are to anomalous data points. Like everyone's data is going to jump around a bit. So the more the earlier you start and the better your historical record on all of this stuff, the less uncertainty I think you have when you start to look at that data.
Yeah, and the other thing is like if you are not brave enough to face your data, then don't bother collecting it. So I've known companies where so they collect employee feedback and discuss it on good years, and then when the feedback is really horrible, that's it. So just be brave and face it. Otherwise, don't bother collecting.
Yeah, it's the
I love it.
Yeah.
Sorry, well, I was just going to add that someone I love reading about data, I think she's the chief data scientist at Google, Cassie Kozaroff is her name, I think, or Koskroff. She writes this thing like, also don't be data inspired in your decision making, like where you go, oh, it's 50%, therefore it makes perfect sense that I'm going to do this. Like she just sort of says, like, to do this right, you do have to be sort of rigorously engaged in knowing what you're trying to do, not being afraid, sort of to Matt's point. Like there are so many different ways data can be used to incentivize a behavior. That's a very sort of targeted way of using data, not like establishing truth. And I think there's like a really, if you're engaging in data, don't be overly confident. I think that's always the key thing. Like data should be about reducing uncertainty, but like in the same way that its content is uncertainty. So like, I think that's part of the challenge where when you're creating the data, you're setting up the infrastructure, you have to make it structured. You have to make it sort of orderly to build it. But then if you're trying to sort of use it in these kind of different ways that are a bit softer, a bit more complicated, it is kind of two processes, two different steps. And how you do that, I think, is you need to do the first, which is the building, and then the second, which is sort of so what are we going to do with this? But to Matt's points, that's where the value comes, kind of. I mean, it's where the danger can arise as well.
I think I just build on that, Elisa. I think there's like a humility in decision making that comes. Like it would be really, a leader can do this without data as much as they could do it with data, but without data, you can be supremely confident in the decisions that you're making because it's just your opinion, right? And almost you can come across as anxious or not being sure of your opinion, and lots of different leadership books will tell you whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but you can be overconfident or underconfident in your opinion. But once you have data, you can also treat it arrogantly or with humility as well. You know, you can either go, well, I've got the data that proves my point, which it rarely does in all the circumstances that we've been talking about, because we're not publishing a paper that is scientifically rigorous that says, yes, this is what we have discovered through this. We're hopefully, I think what we're all saying is actually we're just making a more informed decision than we might otherwise have made, and there is still that room for uncertainty. So this sort of humble leadership, I think, is still, with or without data, still really important. Sorry, your point before, just that's what it made me think of. You've got, there's a layer of ambiguity and even softness in the way that you use the data to make it most useful for you. Does that make any sense? Yes.
Yeah, it's all the data we still end up as just humans in the end, unfortunately. You know, for better or worse, that is sort of how it works. And I think it's sort of the challenge of our age is about navigating that. And I think especially in a scale up, you know, you are running by the seat of your pants, trying to make it all work. And I think data can feel like a very slow, methodical process, and it should, you know, and use that to counteract sort of the fires, and embrace that as sort of a slower moment, and then use it to sort of maybe maybe you can preempt the fire that's coming down the way, hopefully, with some effective data use.
Can I ask just one question, which is slightly a side topic, and then we'll come back for some final pieces of advice and closing remarks. But I just didn't think we could talk about the topic of data without just touching on how comfortable employees might be around their employers collecting data. So I appreciate some of the basics of data. Employees know that it has to be collected for them to be paid and time and those sorts of things. But when we start to talk about creating quite bespoke people experiences, potentially about knowing certain events, about knowing certain like what our employees are doing on the systems that they're working with, where do you think employees are at in terms of comfort levels around employers collecting that data, knowing full well that, you know, the consumer world collects vast quantities of data about us all the time without us knowing? Yes, Soo Ling, your thoughts on that topic?
There is a slight difference, I guess. It's neither is good. So I think for consumers, we kind of got used to it. So like, and the other thing is with employers, like people feel like they are working for the employer, and it's always about trust. Like, how much do you trust them? But what is the culture of the company? Do you think they are collecting it for your good, or do you think they're collecting your data just to get back at you? So it really depends on the company culture and the trust. Yeah. So that's like when you start thinking about collecting data, you have to get that bit right first. For example, a lot of companies, they like to know their employees, so they like to collect like personality information. For many companies, that's fine. But for some companies, the people are feeling like, oh, am I going to not be promoted because I'm an introvert? And they think so. But that's more not the problem with the data collection, but the culture or how the people perceive the company. But I think it's always sensitive. And the more data you collect, the more analysis you're doing. Yeah, and whether or not it's kind of anonymized or higher level, or you can link it directly to a person. So yeah, it's always sensitive. Yeah.
Okay. Any divergent views or additional views on that?
No,
Elisa. On that.
Go for it, Elisa.
Elisa.
Okay, I'll go. So I think, I mean, as I've said, like sort of, I've spent a lot of time in large corporations where your laptop isn't yours, your phone isn't yours. You kind of have a baseline assumption that what you're doing is accessible to someone if they need to look at it. You know, it's not really private domain. So I think in that sense, there is sort of a publicness of work, which is quite clear, you know, like what, because I guess I'm thinking more about what they're passively collecting rather than what they're actively collecting, because I think that's where things get a little bit hairy. If you're actively collecting, you know, I mean, and then again, there's surveys, which is a whole other topic that I won't touch. But I think in terms of this sort of passive collection is really one of those things that people are afraid of because they don't know or they may not know. And I'm very skeptical about its effectiveness anyway, like in terms of, when you hear about sort of activity monitoring things or, really like, why are you, like I don't have an issue with an employer having access to these things. They've given me the tools. It is their email account. It is these other things that they've created that I'm using. I expect them to have access to what is going on. But to Soo Ling's point, if it's trying to be like, to treat me like I'm not doing something forthright, that's where things go south really fast. And that's also where I think human ingenuity will always win. Like I might be a little bit of an optimist in this, but I love all of those sort of, you can look to criminals and their ability to sort of trick Google Nest cameras into like turning on and off, or like finding a way around a system is kind of what we're great at. So I don't think I would never put too much faith in one of those systems just because I think it's not so accurate, but I'd also question why do you feel you need that?
And the other point is the GDPR thing, like how, when you're collecting data, how safe are they? Will the data leak out to someone else? And all these things need to be under like very careful consideration.
And it's a huge responsibility to have that kind of data.
Yeah. Matt, would you add anything to what's already been shared or all said?
No, I completely, I think the foundational piece is the trust and the culture. Like, do you feel comfortable sharing that? I think it's interesting that at the moment, Amazon knows more about me than my employer does, right? Amazon knows, and particularly if you look at it from the perspective of employee experience, like how are you going to give people better experiences if you don't know the things about them that they find interesting? If you don't know, like, Amazon knows if I'm getting married, they know if I'm having a kid, they know when my kids' birthdays are, all of those sorts of things that my employer doesn't. Now, if you're an organization that wants to create those sort of resonant experiences with people, but the only data you hold on them is what they're paid and what their job title is, you don't really give yourself the opportunity to do that. I think what's really interesting as you sort of look ahead a little bit is when you get into wearables and prop tech and those sorts of things, like I can see, take me, I'd be reasonably comfortable sharing my wearable data with a company I trust. If they're collecting my sleep pattern because they're going to monitor it, and like and they go, oh, I wake up, they say, oh, Matt, it's the third night in a row you haven't had any sleep. We know that you've got 3 meetings. We know that from the data you're just going to go and make everyone else grumpy. So we've taken the step of cancelling those meetings, rescheduling them for next Tuesday, go back to bed. Then I can see like, okay, I get that. That helps me be more effective, But if they're doing it because they're just monitoring whether I'm busy or not, like some 1984 thing, then everyone's gonna fight against that system. And so I genuinely, like Soo Ling's point about culture, I really do think it's important. Like I think if you can create that culture where people trust you, that you are creating this, you are collecting this data so that we can make it better for you. Right, so that we can say, rather than you getting burnt out and having to take 3 weeks off, we can use the data to predict what's coming. Let's do something about that now. Then I think people will be quite open to sharing the sort of data that they share with Amazon and Apple and all the other consumer brands that we love. If you haven't got that trust, you're not going to ever be able to get that information or use it. And I think that'll be an interesting divide, like how people feel about their employer, the level of trust, the level that they're prepared to give away that data, and what's the payback for it.
Yeah, and also you need to make sure that the company doesn't change hands. Like you have a trusting culture that collects all your data and then they sell it to some.
I was kind of, part of me is intrigued by what you're saying, Matt, and then part of me is also very hesitant about it. Not because I don't think it's possible. I think it totally is. I think that perhaps
I read also a case study of, I think it was a South Korean shipping company, and they had their people wearing wearables, and they were monitoring signals for tiredness and fatigue because they knew that if you drop below a certain threshold, your likelihood of accident went up. Right now, I can totally get, like, that's a good use of data. you know, and so long as you're doing that in a like, I'm not blaming you for the fact that you're tired. Like, let's just get you off shift so you don't hurt yourself or someone
Actually,
around
that's very useful for lorry drivers and things like that.
Well,
It's
I was gonna
health
say all the
sensitive.
telemetry
Mm.
data and lorry drivers are extremely regulated in their, like, if they exceed it, they will have to stop. I mean, professional drivers in general. So like there is sort of, yes, of course, I think there are use cases for these sorts of things. It's just like, am I sitting in my apartment working on my laptop, the use case? I might make people's lives a bit around me a bit unpleasant. And like, if we had a good culture, I could take a mental health day without like my Apple Watch telling me that I'm tired, which I find that that's what my Apple Watch mostly does, is tell me things I already know.
I think the point, I think my point, take your Apple Watch and being tired. It will tell you you're tired, and you probably won't act on that because we're all
I know I'm tired.
Yeah, I'm just going to soldier on. But if, and it's just a hypothesis, if that information was shared with your team or your manager, then it gives them the opportunity to say, listen, Elisa, it's fine. I know you've been working really hard. Take tomorrow off in a way that makes you more productive next week and is better for you. And I think it's that sharing. You know, we talked about it throughout today. How do you translate that data into a decision that creates a better experience for people? And sometimes I think, you know, with the nudge data, sharing it with the people around you gives you the license to act on it in a way that if you're the only one with that data, it's actually quite difficult to.
Interesting.
And for me, it was the decision making around it was felt in your vignette, Matt. It felt like the decision making sat with the company, not with the individual. I know this, so I'm going to reschedule your meetings, which is a world that feel.
Listen, if you want to set up your Apple Watch so that every time Sasha keeps you awake all night and you cancel our catch up in the morning, I'm fine with that. Just like being an absolute mess. He's only going to moan at you.
We would literally never have a catch up. I would do no work. I was going to get everybody to just do a quick one piece of advice on what to do about people data for if you're you're sitting in a scaling business, you're either the founder, the chief operating officer, or maybe the first head of people, depending on the scale. What's one piece of advice to do something positive around what you're doing with your people data?
Well, know why you are collecting it and then do something good with it. Don't just let it sit there.
Okay, I'll go. I'll go, but I'm not sure it's a positive, but I'd say, like, my kind of big belief about data is that it's already existing around you, you know, so it's already there, whether you are calling it data or not. You know, I think the best example of this is like the fact that we like people with experience, you know, to take on more senior jobs is an evidence that like we assume that they have learned something over those years. So just remember that like you are already data informed, and look around at your business and look around at the numbers that sort of live within it and see what those are telling you before you get all crazy and build up some new systems, you know, like you've created a data culture, whether you've intended to or not. So just take a breath, like take a look at what you've got.
Good advice. Good advice, Matt.
I think my thing would be don't introduce anything new without a feedback loop on its efficacy. Don't put new people stuff in without working out how you'll know if it's worked or not.
Don't just look for the confirmation that I've done a great job. Cool. Thank you all so much. We're bang on 5 o'clock. Look at that. I've loved this conversation. This is the last in our series on HR tech scale-ups. I'm just going to put up contact details of everybody there so you can have a look. If anybody does want to reach out to us, we're all available, all very friendly people, hopefully evidenced by this conversation today. So we'd love to talk to you. There will be all the HR Tech series are live on our website. This recording will be going live in a couple of days, and we'll be sending out a quick summary of everything that we've learned over the course of the last. I think these have been running for about 3.5, 4 months now. So, and we look forward to our next webinar series, which is going to be starting in the autumn. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll speak to everyone soon.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.